Luke Skywalker was one of the most powerful Force users of all time, becoming a great Jedi Master after the Galactic Civil War. In the years following the Battle of Endor, Luke aided the fledgling New Republic in maintaining order across the galaxy and defeating Imperial remnants. Luke faced many battles, such as the resurgence of Grand Admiral Thrawn and his clash with the insane Dark Jedi clone Joruus C'baoth. After that, the resurrected Emperor Palpatine returned to the galaxy, forcing Luke to temporarily fall to the dark side in an attempt to destroy the darkness from within. After being redeemed by his friends, Luke formed the new Jedi Order in 11 ABY, establishing his Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4. Over the next several decades, Luke would study the power of the Force, growing stronger as he endured many conflicts like the Black Fleet Crisis, the Almanian Uprising, and the Yuuzhan Vong War, and eventually taking the title of Grand Master in 36 ABY. I want to examine Luke's Force powers across his lifetime, from his earliest training with Obi-Wan to his abilities as the master of his new Jedi Order. Inheriting immense strength in the Force from his father, Luke actually had the potential to rival Anakin, meaning that he had the ability to become what his father could have had he never been injured on Mustafar. Luke was gifted with the full Force potential of the Chosen One, which at his peak would have made him essentially a godlike being. Even when he was barely trained, Luke displayed remarkable strength in the Force, using its power to guide the proton torpedoes to destroy the first Death Star. 3 years later, he was able to build his own lightsaber using instructions left behind by Obi-Wan, successfully forming a synthetic crystal and aligning the components of the hilt. In later years, Luke became incredibly strong in more personal applications of the Force's power. After he was fatally wounded in a battle between the Singing Mountain clan and the Night Sisters, he was able to completely heal himself with the Force over the span of a few hours. He was proficient enough in Force speed that he could increase the speed of his lightsaber strikes to the point that time seemed to be in slow motion, and he felt as though the Force guided his movements in combat. Luke was also very skilled in telekinesis. During a food fight inside the Jedi Praxium, he was able to freeze every single piece and drop of food or drink in midair all at once, with everything only dropping once he consciously released it. Luke was also able to telekinetically absorb the blasts of an AT-AT's ion cannons, before destroying it with only the Force. In perhaps his greatest feat of telekinesis, Luke sustained and moved an artificial black hole with the Force during the Battle of Dantooine. Luke also mastered several rare and difficult Force abilities during his time forming the new Jedi Order. While searching for his first Jedi students, he was able to walk on lava and battle a fireworm simultaneously. Luke also trained to overcome the Force blindness that was caused by the Ysalamiri, a species that created bubbles within the Force as an adaptation against predators. In one of the greatest fights of his life, Luke was able to enter a plane within the Force known as Beyond Shadows, existing outside of time or space, and he used his power in the Force to defeat Abeloth with the help of Darth Krayt. In perhaps one of his most insanely powerful feats, during the Battle of Yuzan-Tar, Luke was able to consciously reach a state of oneness within the Force. While this state was usually reserved for those who had died and passed into the netherworld of the Force, Luke was able to enter this state at will, becoming an extension of the Force itself. He became a storm of luminous Force energy, exceeding physical existence in the battle. To those watching the battle, it looked as though Luke was a blur of 20 lightsabers engaging his enemies. Luke was also able to call upon the power of the light side, using his love for his son Ben and wife Mara Jade until the full power of the light side of the Force rushed into him, causing his cells to burst with power and his skin to glow. Luke used this ability in one of his confrontations with Abeloth. It's also worth noting that after Luke returned from the dark side of the Force, he realized that he was more powerful than he had ever been because he respected and understood the dangers of the dark side. Okay, so as you guys can tell, Luke's Force powers in Legends are absolutely insane. I can't even cover them all, so just consider these to be like the greatest hits. He was pretty overpowered, but only because he was the son of the Chosen One and he actually inherited Anakin's potential in the Force. So in the Legends books, basically across 30 years worth of stories and 100 or 2 books, Luke became more powerful than Anakin ever was. This is why most people will refer to Luke as the most powerful Force user of all time. And while that's never been explicitly stated that he is the most powerful Force user of all time, it's pretty much left up to opinion. George Lucas stated himself that Luke had the potential to become what Anakin never could, so it's up to you. Luke is absolutely one of the most powerful Force users for sure, but he could also very well be the most powerful of all time. After losing his lightsaber on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker was in desperate need of a new weapon to continue his Jedi training. Having no knowledge of where to find or build a new one, Luke returned to Tatooine, searching for knowledge in the old hut of Obi-Wan Kenobi. How Luke came to construct his legendary green lightsaber is explained in the Legends novel Shadows of the Empire. The hut was a small structure on the edge of the Dune Sea, and he discovered that Obi-Wan had not left much behind. The most valuable thing that remained was an old boa wood trunk, the contents of which included an ancient leather-bound book. The thumbprint clasp attached to the book had accepted Luke's right thumb to unlock it, and he discovered a small explosive rigged inside. If anyone else had attempted to open the book, it would have burst into flames. Somehow, Obi-Wan had known that Luke would find the book, and prepared it so that only he could open it. Luke found that amazing. The pages of the book contained all kinds of knowledge that a Jedi student would need, such as plans for building a lightsaber. According to the book, the best lightsabers used natural crystals. However, it was impossible for Luke to find one on Tatooine. During the reign of the Empire, the Imperials made great efforts to destroy the last remaining resources of the Jedi Order, banning all crystals capable of being used in lightsabers. The Empire overtook, destroyed, and shut down the sites that possessed crystals naturally, so Luke was forced to fabricate a synthetic crystal. He had managed to collect most of the electronic and mechanical parts he needed in Mos Eisley, such as power cells, controls, and a high-energy reflector cup. Ideally, the best lightsabers contained 3 crystals, consisting of different densities and facets, in order to produce a fully adjustable blade. However, since it was his first attempt at building a lightsaber, Luke decided to simplify the weapon as much as possible, opting to use only 1 crystal. Using a small furnace, Luke fabricated the crystal, cooking it at incredible heat and pressure. He had no idea how long the entire process took, but it had taken him a month to get to the point of creating the crystal itself. Once it was finished, he would be able to cut and mold it, and tune it to the conditions of the hilt. Luke was very nervous about constructing the saber, as he worried that he might misread the instructions and cause the weapon to explode when he tried to ignite it. He wondered if he might accidentally disintegrate himself and become known as the Jedi Knight that had been vaporized by a faulty lightsaber. He worried that he would fail in building it, since he had worked for a month on only the crystal, while the book said that a Jedi Master could construct a saber within a few days. Luke anticipated that he may need to build several sabers before he got one that worked correctly. When the crystal was finally done, Luke set to work meticulously chiseling and hammering away, cracking off slivers to achieve the perfect size and shape. The cuts became trickier as he progressed, and if he hit the crystal too hard, he would shatter it and have to start over. Finally, after the crystal was inserted into the completed hilt, Luke went outside to test the saber. That way, if it blew up, it would at least not destroy Obi-Wan's hut. He instructed R2 to wait inside, so that if he was disintegrated, someone could tell Leia what happened. When he was alone, he pushed the ignition switch, and the glowing green blade extruded to full length, humming with power. Relieved, he studied the saber, noticing that it felt perfectly balanced, even more than his father's. The blade gave off no heat, indicating that the superconductors worked properly. As R2 approached, Luke deactivated the saber, feeling relief that he had successfully built the elegant weapon and it worked. That meant something. As he looked up at the sky, he thought to himself that maybe he would learn to become a Jedi Master after all. After losing his hand and lightsaber on Cloud City, Luke Skywalker returned to Tatooine, searching Obi-Wan Kenobi's hut for answers and Jedi knowledge. This story was first told in the Legends novel Shadows of the Empire, explaining how Luke built his green lightsaber. However, it was also expanded upon in The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi, where Luke takes a closer look at Obi-Wan's journal and learns about the Clone Wars and, most importantly, the duel with Darth Vader on Mustafar. It's important to remember that this story takes place immediately after Episode 5, so Luke is still unsure if Vader really is his father, Anakin Skywalker, which is why he wants to learn the truth so badly. Of course, Obi-Wan is well known for bending the truth or wording things from a certain point of view, and his journal entries are no different. Still, Luke learning about the Mustafar duel is a truly monumental moment. As Luke drew closer to the entrance of Kenobi's hut, he sensed a strange tension in the air that reminded him of the disturbing sensation he felt in the cave on Dagobah. Stepping into the small living area, he found the chest that Obi-Wan had extracted his first lightsaber from, the saber that was once his father's. Luke opened the chest and was dismayed to find it completely empty. He hadn't expected to find a lightsaber, but he had hoped to find anything useful. If not a data tape or recording, at least some kind of clue. It didn't take long for Luke to find a trap door within the floor that led to the cellar. Down the bedrock steps, he found Obi-Wan's stores of food and water, a workbench surrounded by shelves of tools, and an intricately carved boa wood box. The keypad on the box opened at the touch of his thumbprint, and inside he found several books. The largest was a leather-bound volume that seemed ancient. On the first pages of that one was a note from Obi-Wan written for Luke, stating that the future of the Jedi Knights was in his hands. Luke blinked at the words as if to confirm they were real, that he wasn't just having a dream. The book felt suddenly very heavy in his hands. He set it down carefully on the workbench and began turning the pages. Every page was filled with handwritten text, and his heart began pounding harder as the various words and phrases caught his attention. Jedi Council, Old Republic, Battle of Naboo, Sith Lords, Jedi Temple, Separatist Movement, Battle of Geonosis, the Clone Wars. Luke stopped to catch his breath. He knew he should start at the beginning, but the book was so thick and he was impatient to find two names in particular. He began flipping through the pages even faster, scanning the text for the names, Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader, that he believed were the keys to the answers he sought. Ever since the duel on Cloud City, the two questions that dominated his mind were if Darth Vader was truly his father, and if he was, why Obi-Wan didn't tell him the truth. Kenobi had told him that he had served with his father, Anakin, during the Clone Wars, so when Luke finally found an entry about the Clone Wars in the journal, he became excited since his knowledge of the war was relatively limited. Most of the facts came from old data tapes, but only those that had been authorized by the Empire. Still, He knew that the Jedi Knights had led clone armies on behalf of the Galactic Republic against the Confederacy of Independent Systems. In the end, the Confederacy lost, the Jedi were accused of attempting to take over the Republic, and the Republic's leader, Palpatine, was proclaimed Emperor. According to Obi-Wan, it was Darth Vader who helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi. Luke turned his attention to the entry he had found and started reading it. Obi-Wan had made a notation that indicated the entry was almost 20 years old.
And then the purge began. I would soon learn that I was among the few Jedi to survive and that Palpatine had taken a new apprentice, my former student, Darth Vader. And because of Darth Vader, Anakin was gone as well. When I finally caught up with Vader, I sensed nothing but pure evil about him. For unlike Ventress, Vader was not a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Yes, he had his struggles and his shortcomings, but he was not a weak being who feared abandonment. He was a powerful man who had been given opportunities to better himself, yet he only craved more power, and chose his own path to betray the Jedi and become a Sith. He was my greatest failure. My duel with Vader was awful in its savagery. In the end, he was more determined to kill me than defend himself, and was blind with fury when I felled him. I left him maimed and burning on the shores of a lava river. To have dealt him a killing blow might have been the merciful thing to do, but I had no mercy for Vader. Because I am a Jedi, not a cold-blooded murderer, all I could do was leave Vader to his fate. Had I killed then and there, I believe I would have taken a step onto the same dark path that he had found so impossible to resist. But by leaving him for dead, I fear I failed yet again, for I soon learned that Vader had survived in a fashion. Like the late General Grievous, he is mostly machine now, a malevolent construct of pistons and gears, plastoid and wires. His mortal remains fueled by the dark side. The galaxy will never know peace until Darth Vader and the Emperor breathe their last. It is hard for me to see what the future holds. Fortunately, I have my mission and my ongoing studies of the Force to help me be mindful of the present, as well as the daily rigors of survival on Tatooine. Whatever tomorrow may bring, I must be ready for it.
By the time Luke reached the end of the entry, he realized he'd been holding his breath for over a minute. Exhaling slowly, he returned to the beginning, scanning the text to see if he had missed something. He had never heard of Asajj Ventress, Count Dooku, an Iridonian Zabrak, or any of the battles that Obi-Wan had mentioned, but these revelations barely even registered. Luke was frustrated that Kenobi hadn't written more about Anakin and Vader. He reread aloud the two lines that had especially commanded his attention. Palpatine had taken a new apprentice, my former student, Darth Vader. And because of Darth Vader, Anakin was gone as well. The words sounded hollow in his mouth. Although Obi-Wan had not written in so many words that Darth Vader had killed Anakin, that was what Obi-Wan had told him had happened. He wondered just how carefully Kenobi had chosen his words when he had written that Anakin was gone. And then he read again about how Obi-Wan had left Vader to die. Luke had no illusions that Darth Vader was a killer. Vader had also tortured both Princess Leia and Han Solo on different occasions. On Cloud City, Vader had maimed Luke before inviting him to join the dark side and help him overthrow the Emperor. But despite all the horrible things Vader had done, and despite the fact that Obi-Wan had had no mercy for Vader, Luke was surprised that he felt something other than horror or anger at the thought of the armored Lord of the Sith. He felt sorry for Vader. As a sting of phantom pain chewed at his right wrist where his prosthetic hand began, Luke wondered what exactly had happened all those years ago on an unidentified world along the shores of a lava river. By the time of Return of the Jedi, according to the lore, Luke Skywalker was already more powerful than Darth Vader. That's something that Vader realized in the novelization of the film, as the two of them fought on the second Death Star. I found that surprising, to see it stated outright that Luke was stronger than his father. However, I just finished reading the Legends book Shadows of the Empire, which developed on this thread even more in a shocking way. This book tells the original story of what happened between episodes 5 and 6, and over the course of the book, there are several scenes that feature Darth Vader thinking about Luke, specifically Luke's power in the Force. Vader continues hunting his son ruthlessly across the galaxy, dreaming of converting him to the dark side and ruling the galaxy together as Sith Lords. However, the most insane part of this, at least to me, is that the book reveals that Vader not only considers Luke to have greater potential in the Force than himself and the Emperor, but he actually believes that Luke is the most powerful Jedi of all time. Let's jump right into these scenes and look at Vader's intriguing thoughts. Initially, Vader pondered their duel on Bespin, how he had tried to strike Luke down merely as a test. But although he had attempted to defeat Luke, the boy had somehow held his own, and their duel had excited Vader. He was thrilled to meet a worthy opponent, and he felt pride that the one so strongly opposing him was his own son. He had felt Luke's anger, and he knew that if Luke accepted the dark side, he would become more powerful than himself and the Emperor. As Palpatine focused on the construction of the second Death Star, Vader was not confident in the ability of the new superweapon. After all, much to Vader's satisfaction, it had been Luke of all people that had destroyed the first Death Star, proving that the most powerful weapon in the universe was the Force. As tales of Luke's exploits and growing abilities reached him, Vader became even more confident that he could turn him to the dark side. He knew he could because he had felt the dark side rise in Luke before. He had felt the power of Luke's anger. The boy had lost control once, and he could be free to do it again. Each repetition became easier. The dark side was a path that grew wider and deeper each time you walked upon it. Soon, it would be no effort at all for Luke to allow the dark side to rule him. And the Emperor agreed with Vader that Luke had much power within him. It was raw and untrained, but it was vast. His potential was larger than the Emperor's, larger than Vader's, but it was still only potential and not focused energy. When next they met, Vader would still be more adept, still the master. He would defeat the boy and bring him to the dark side. When that happened, nothing in the galaxy could stop them. None would dare oppose them. All would bow before them. Worlds would tremble under their approach. Sometime later, Luke and Vader nearly crossed paths, and Vader had felt his son's presence in the Force, much stronger than it had ever been before. Luke appeared to him as a powerful locus in the Force. Vader thought of how he had exterminated the remaining Jedi with his own hands, but he realized that he had not yet destroyed the strongest of them all, Luke. As Vader sought to master the powers of the dark side, growing more powerful as a Sith Lord, he was pleased to learn that the Force still held surprises for him. The dark side, like a fire, could warm or burn, and great care needed to be taken not to trip and fall into it. Vader thought of how Palpatine had become deformed and disfigured by his own power within his Force lightning, but Vader vowed that that would never happen to him. He would truly master the dark side, and the key to that goal was Luke. Once he finally turned Luke, the process would go faster. Together, they could manipulate the Force quicker than either could alone. The boy was so strong. Vader wondered who could have known that his own son would turn out to be the most powerful man in the galaxy. That fact caused Vader to smile. So, all of these different thoughts from Vader really caught me by surprise. Obviously, I'm the biggest Luke fanboy, and you know that if you've watched the channel before, but I had never seen anything in the lore officially state that Luke was the most powerful Jedi ever. I've seen people comment this before and tell me how it was officially stated that Luke was the strongest Jedi ever or the strongest Force user ever, and I would always ask for a source and ask them where that was stated, but nobody could ever give me an answer. That's why I was so surprised when I was reading this book. Shadows of the Empire really goes out of its way repetitively to state how powerful Luke is and how much Vader respects his strength. To see it stated multiple times that not only was Luke considered the most powerful man in the galaxy by the time of Return of the Jedi, but that Vader also considered him to be the strongest Jedi ever is honestly insane. Even though this lore is now part of the Legends continuity, I still think that it's amazing and a true testament to Luke's strength as a Jedi Knight. We know that by the time Luke was a Jedi Master down the timeline, he became incredibly powerful, to the point that most will say he was overpowered. It seems that the lore from Shadows of the Empire may have tried to go back in the timeline and retroactively emphasize his power during the original trilogy, in order to make his feats and abilities in the other Legends books seem more plausible. That's just my theory, but either way, I'm so glad that these details were provided in this book. Like I said, Luke is my favorite character in Star Wars, and one of the things that I always wanted to see outside of the 3 movies of the original trilogy was more of his powers and more of his strength, more of his training and all the stuff that he could do in the Force. I always wondered what he did after Return of the Jedi before I had ever read any of the Legends books, but the fact that Shadows of the Empire takes place between Empire and Return of the Jedi just makes this even more entertaining and interesting to me. You guys know that I love all of the additional lore that goes into different characters' thoughts during the events, and even though this is just a book and is not a novelization of the movie, I loved looking into Vader's thoughts on Luke and his power and his strength, kind of giving off the vibe that Vader had admiration for his son, that he really admired and respected how powerful Luke had become. I think that just adds more nuance and more complexity to their relationship and their final encounter in Return of the Jedi. Raised in hiding and ignorant of his true heritage and the history of his family, Luke Skywalker still knew very little about his father after the events of Return of the Jedi. While Luke didn't blame Anakin for his actions during his time as Darth Vader, Leia did, and Luke wished that she could see things as he did. Although he attempted to discuss Anakin with Leia several times and expressed his desire to learn about his father's past, Leia refused. The story of Luke investigating Anakin's origins and the history of his family is told in the Legends book A New Hope: The Life of Luke Skywalker. Luke explained to Leia that he felt compelled to learn about Anakin's life, so that he could understand how he became the man he was, and how certain circumstances of Anakin's life might have affected his decisions. Luke knew that he couldn't learn from his father's mistakes if he didn't know what they were, and by learning about the past, he would be better prepared for the future. Luke took to researching the HoloNet for any and all data about the Jedi Order. Unfortunately, most of the information he found was merely old Imperial propaganda. The Empire's leaders still claimed that the Jedi Knights who had served the Republic during the Clone Wars had been secretly plotting to overthrow the Republic and conquer the galaxy. Luke knew that the data was lies, and that it was the Emperor who had manipulated events to bring down the Jedi Order and fulfill his own ambitions. Luke didn't expect to find any data about Obi-Wan, Yoda, or Anakin. He'd searched the HoloNet before and had only come up empty. However, this time he found something. Luke could hardly believe his eyes when he discovered his father's name in an article that was recently posted by a former pod racer named Clegg Holdfast. Although pod racing remained illegal throughout the galaxy, the destruction of the second Death Star had apparently emboldened Holdfast to write about the outlawed sport. Holdfast's article was a history of the Boonta Eve Classic, a once famous pod race competition that had been held annually at the Mos Espa Arena on Tatooine. The article provided a list of Boonta winners and other participants. According to the data, Anakin Skywalker's victory had occurred 36 years earlier. Luke studied the article with amazement. After the conflicting accounts he'd heard from his uncle and aunt as well as Obi-Wan, he'd begun to wonder whether his father had ever been on Tatooine at all. Now it appeared he had proof. He navigated through the article and found a holographic image and schematics of Anakin's pod racer, Unfortunately, Holdfast had not provided any images of Anakin himself. Luke scanned through the article, learning that the Mos Espa Arena had become a track for swoop bike races and 2 veteran pilots of the Bunta were currently employed as mechanics. Luke decided right then that he was overdue for a vacation. As he returned to his homeworld of Tatooine, Luke remembered how he had told Obi-Wan that he would never return, yet he had several times. He landed his X-Wing on the roof of the Mos Espa Grand Arena, and he made his way to the 2 mechanics he was looking for, Odi Mandrell and Teemto Pagales. From them, Luke learned as much information about Anakin's role in pod racing as he could. They recalled how Anakin was only 9 when he had won the Bunta, how he was a speed demon, and he never cheated in a race. Luke asked if they knew where Anakin had lived, and they directed him to Mos Espa, instructing him to visit Watto's junk shop, which was now owned by Anakin's childhood friend, Wald. As Luke made his way to Wald's shop in Mos Espa, he was confused by R2's insistence about accompanying him. Inside the shop, Luke thought of how much he would have loved this place in his youth, filled with metal scrap and odd bits of machinery. Meeting Wald, Luke said that he was looking to find out information on Anakin Skywalker. From Wald, Luke would learn the shocking truth of Anakin's life on Tatooine, and how he had not only won the Bunta Eve, but won his freedom as well. Wald told Luke how Anakin and his mother Shmi were once Watto's slaves, and how Anakin had left Tatooine with a Jedi Knight. Wald told Luke how Shmi had stayed behind and remained a slave after Anakin left. Wald said that Shmi had looked out for him after that, and had been sold and married to the farmer Klieg Lars, and that he had even attended their wedding in Anchorhead. At hearing all of this information about his grandmother, Luke's memory flashed to the unmarked graves on the Lars homestead, where he knew that she rested. Wald mentioned how awful the circumstances of Shmi's death was, and informed Luke how she had been abducted and killed by Tusken Raiders. Luke's knees felt weak, and he steadied himself on R2, before abruptly telling Wald that he had to go. The air outside was even hotter than in the shop, but Luke took a deep breath anyway. He had spent so many years wondering about the life of Anakin Skywalker and had been so excited when he discovered that his father had been a pod racer pilot on Tatooine. Now he just felt drained and exhausted. He thought of how awful it was that his father and grandmother were once slaves. And then he felt outraged. Not just because of the injustice of Anakin and Shmi's lives, but because Owen and Beru had never told him. But then he wondered if Owen and Beru even knew that Shmi was once a slave. He also realized that Obi-Wan must have known. Yet Luke realized that he wasn't angry with Owen, Beru, or Obi-Wan. He knew in his heart that there was a reason they had not told him the truth about so many things. They'd only been doing what they thought best to protect him. Right off the bat, the title of this video may sound ridiculous. After all, we know that the dark side of the Force is not stronger than the light. It's simply easier to use, but it is a corruption and a path to evil. In the expanded universe, now called Legends, Luke Skywalker eventually turned to the dark side and became the apprentice of the reborn Emperor Palpatine, just a few years after Return of the Jedi. This story is told in Dark Empire, which I'll admit isn't my favorite. Many argue that Luke in Dark Empire is completely out of character, and I would agree for the most part. I'm not a fan of Luke ever turning to the dark side. However, I do enjoy how the events of Dark Empire evolve Luke's character going into other books in the expanded universe, specifically the Jedi Academy trilogy that takes place a year later in 11 ABY. The lore surrounding Luke's turn to the dark side and redemption in Dark Empire is fascinating, and we can turn to books like Star Wars: The Essential Chronology, the Encyclopedia Jedi vs. Sith: The Essential Guide to the Force, and Jedi Search by Kevin J. Anderson to fully understand why and how Luke was more powerful after turning to the dark side. What we need to do first, before looking at Luke's power afterwards, is understand the events of Dark Empire. Whether you've read the comic series or not, it's important to know what happened. In 10 ABY, Emperor Palpatine returned from the dead, and the Imperial remnants laid waste to Coruscant. Luke Skywalker, commanding New Republic forces on the planet's surface, had sensed a dark force growing, an evil power reaching out to him. When a hole opened in space, a force storm that sucked in everything through a rift in the universe, Luke allowed himself to be pulled through it. On the deep core world of Biss, Luke was taken prisoner and brought before the source of the dark side nexus he had felt, the cloned reincarnation of Emperor Palpatine. The Emperor had established a laboratory and stronghold on Biss, where dozens of clone bodies waited to hold his energy force. Restored to physical life by ancient Sith secrets, the Emperor quietly rebuilt his forces, preparing a massive blow against all who would oppose him. On Biss, Palpatine tempted Luke, trying to use the same tactics that had drawn his father, Anakin, to evil. No longer the impulsive youth at war with his own anger, Luke faced a moment of great decision. He believed he had to use the Emperor's own knowledge of the dark side against him. Thinking he could be stronger than his father, believing he could trick Palpatine and destroy the dark side from within, Luke agreed to join him and become his apprentice. Although Luke eventually attempted to sabotage Palpatine's plans even as the dark side's hold on him tightened by destroying all but one of Palpatine's clone bodies in the laboratory, the Emperor was able to transfer his consciousness into the final remaining clone and defeated Luke in a lightsaber duel. It would take Leia's power in the Force to finally redeem Luke, and the Skywalker twins turned on Palpatine, believing they defeated him for good. Luke, now redeemed and returned to the light side of the Force, believed that it was time for the Jedi Knights to return to the galaxy. Sometime later, Luke would record in his own words that he had chosen to learn the ways of the dark side in the hopes of understanding why his father had walked that path. He felt that he needed to know what drove Anakin to become Darth Vader willingly. Now, the book Jedi Search, which is the first in the Jedi Academy trilogy, delves into how the effects of the dark side changed Luke and made him more powerful. In 11 ABY, Luke was finally ready to search for his first Jedi students, but he found himself terrified to do so, as he thought of the violence and darkness he had experienced during Palpatine's resurrection. The struggle within him during his time in thrall to the dark side had been great, and it was only with Leia's help and love that he had been able to break free. Luke felt that he had been through the fire. His heart now felt like a diamond-hard lump in his chest. He was no longer a Jedi Knight. He was now the last remaining Jedi Master. He had survived tests and challenges more immense than his training had ever prepared him for. Luke understood more about the Force now than he had ever thought possible, and it terrified him. After learning the ways of the dark side, he knew of the full powers of the Force, both sides of it, and he was stronger than ever before, which was why he now granted himself the rank of Jedi Master. So, as I said before, Dark Empire is not my favorite. I've read the first one, Dark Empire, twice. I've read Dark Empire 2 and Empire's End once, and they're not my favorite. I think they're pretty weird stories, and you guys will probably know if you've watched my videos before that Luke is my favorite character ever. He is my hero and my favorite character in Star Wars, and I don't really like him turning to the dark side at all in any shape or form. Part of Luke's character is his ability to resist the dark side like he does in Return of the Jedi and always remain optimistic and hopeful. However, I do enjoy how it's portrayed that he wanted to understand Anakin and Darth Vader, and he felt that he could destroy the dark side from within. I think that's pretty cool, and it is inevitable for the dark side to corrupt him once he lets it in, so I get that, and I accept the events of Dark Empire and the Legends continuity, but I also really enjoy how they influence Luke in the rest of the expanded universe, specifically how Dark Empire sets him up for the Jedi Academy trilogy. That is one of my favorite details. The Jedi Academy trilogy is probably my favorite trilogy in Legends. I think it's fantastic, and I think Dark Empire really set it up well. I do like the idea of Luke learning the ways of the dark side and then returning to the light side and being more powerful than he ever was. While that may kind of sound ridiculous because the dark side is not stronger than the light, it does make sense to understand both sides of the Force and then become an even more powerful Force user. I feel like that's kind of treading on gray Jedi territory, which we know doesn't exist, but I feel like it makes sense when you look into it. It kind of reminds me of how Palpatine explains to Anakin that in order to fully understand the Force, you can't just look at the narrow, dogmatic view of the Jedi, you need to understand both sides of it. And while you can't use the dark side and the light side simultaneously, that is not how it works. If you know about it and you have that knowledge, it can make you more powerful. This also reminds me of the Revan book, if you guys haven't read that in the Old Republic timeline. Basically, Revan was a Jedi, and then he became a Sith Lord, and then he got his memory wiped and became a Jedi again. But once he regained his full memories of being a Sith Lord, he was able to channel the Force into its purest form using both the light and the dark side, and he called himself Revan Reborn, and he was like the most powerful that he had ever been. So I don't really know if he was using the light and dark sides at the same time, but he used his knowledge of both sides since he had been both a Jedi and a Sith Lord, and he was incredibly powerful. And that's kind of how I interpret where Luke is standing at the beginning of the Jedi Academy trilogy. He grants himself the rank of Jedi Master, and he says that he understands more about the Force than he ever thought possible, and it's scary. I really enjoy that. I think that is fascinating, and that's why I wanted to make this video, to talk about that, to talk about why Luke was stronger after he had spent time on the dark side as Palpatine's apprentice. I just think that's really interesting, and I think it opens up possibilities to what we understand about the Force, at least in the Legends timeline. During the Galactic Civil War, as Luke Skywalker trained to become a Jedi and topple the Galactic Empire, while also confronting the darkness within his father, Darth Vader, Luke faced the power of the dark side head-on. In the Legends continuity, these struggles became even worse for Luke in the years that followed, as the resurrected Emperor Palpatine briefly turned Luke to the dark side. Luke was eventually redeemed by Leia, and he came to understand the Force in ways he never thought possible. Not only was he more powerful than he had ever been, but he was wiser. In the Legends Encyclopedia, Jedi vs. Sith, The Essential Guide to the Force, there is a passage written by Luke where he gives his unique thoughts on the dark side of the Force and why he thought that it could never be defeated. During my training with my master, Yoda, on Dagobah, I had a vision of Leia, Han, and Chewbacca in a city in the clouds. They were in pain. Yoda told me it was the future I'd seen, and that if I left Dagobah, I might help my friends or possibly destroy all for which they had fought and suffered. I chose to leave against the advice of both Yoda and the spirit of Obi-Wan Kenobi, who told me I would be tempted by the dark side. Somehow, they sensed I would confront Darth Vader at Cloud City. Obi-Wan had told me that Vader killed my father, so I believed he thought I might be seeking revenge. I regret that I did not heed my master's cautions, that I took the situation personally and regarded it as something like a challenge. No matter what my master said, I actually believed that Han and Leia would die if I didn't go to them immediately. There was also the matter of dealing with Vader. It was so hard not to feel fear and anger at the thought of facing him. I didn't know if I could stop Vader, but I was prepared to sacrifice myself to save my friends. I thought the dark side was something I could handle, an adversary that I could ultimately conquer. I was wrong, and I walked right into Vader's trap. Vader had captured my friends to lure me to Cloud City. He was waiting for me, and I was unprepared for our duel. He didn't just beat me, he ruined me, and when he was done, he told me that he was not the man who'd killed my father. He was my father. He tempted me with the power of the dark side, invited me to join with him against the Emperor so that we could rule the galaxy together. And even though I was still in shock from the physical wounds inflicted by Vader as well as his monstrous claim, I sensed he was telling me the truth about our relationship. I also knew his invitation was legitimate. To my horror, it seemed for a moment that accepting his offer would be a logical move, the only one that might ensure I'd survive the hour. It even flashed through my mind that I could pretend to ally with him, then attempt to escape at a later time. Yet somehow, instinctively, I knew such a desperate plan would fail, and that I could never join him. I also knew that I had to get away from him immediately. Back on Dagobah, I'd never envisioned that I would be the one who needed to be rescued. I barely managed to escape Vader, and would have died if Leia hadn't responded to my telepathic plea. What did I accomplish at Cloud City? Except for gaining devastating knowledge about my lineage and the dark side's hold on my father, practically nothing. I didn't save Han, and I only further endangered Leia and the others on the Falcon by urging them to return to Cloud City to get me. In hindsight, I believe there was only one thing I'd done right. I'd refused Vader's offer. But there was little satisfaction in that at the time, for I had also learned that my masters were right, that my Jedi training was far from over, and that I was not immune to the dark side. Just as those who are not predisposed to dishonesty might fleetingly consider the thoughts of thieves, the noblest of Force users are vulnerable to the dark side. You may not think yourself especially curious, easily angered, or envious, but the dark side is a strong seducer. It is a power that draws from subconscious fears, plays off innocent desires, and feeds off selfish thoughts to transform one into a living nightmare. You will find at some point that the dark side will speak to you. It is seductive, offering you everything with little effort on your part, but you can identify it by your own emotions. If you use the knowledge of its presence for enlightenment to help others, it may be from the light side. But if you use it for your own advancement, out of anger or revenge, then the power is tainted. Don't use it. You will know when you are calm and passive. Master Yoda said that once you start down the dark path, it will forever dominate your destiny. And yet, during the time of Palpatine's return as a clone, I went over to the dark side. I did so for a variety of reasons, some of which seemed to make sense at the time, and many of which still cause me difficulty. But I had to do it. I had to know my father. I had to know why he chose the dark side. The powers of control and destruction weren't the only things I found in the dark side. I also found great isolation and sadness. I found fear. These are the feelings my father felt, the feelings even the Emperor felt in his moments of darkest triumph. What I experienced has given me an understanding of the dark side that is vital to the fight against it. More importantly, the love of my sister and my friends drew me back. It redeemed me. Even the foulest victim of the dark side can be redeemed. However, my experience also taught me that the dark side cannot be conquered, no more than the light side can be extinguished. You can fight the dark side and even have victories, but the battle itself can never really end. Learn from the lessons others have endured, so their strength can become your strength. 8 years after the Battle of Yavin, Luke Skywalker discovered nearly 350-year-old data tapes on Dathomir containing information on the subject of training Jedi. This discovery would mark the first step in the establishment of Luke's Jedi Academy. Because Luke had never received a traditional Jedi education, he studied the tapes to further his own knowledge and abilities. These tapes, like the Tedrin holocron and the texts recovered from the Jedi Library on Ossus, contained little information about the hierarchy of the Jedi Order, but there was invaluable data regarding Jedi training, meditation, and lightsaber forms. Although Luke knew that the Order could not be restored to its former glory, he believed that it could be reinvented. 3 years after the recovery of the data tapes, in 11 ABY, the New Republic granted permission for Luke to seek out students whom he could train to become the next generation of Jedi. Whereas the Jedi of old had been conscripted as infants into the Jedi Order and were generally forbidden to marry and have children, Luke was willing to consider anyone who demonstrated some ability with the Force, regardless of their age. Because he knew that the galaxy needed a new generation of Jedi and knew firsthand that the Force was strong in certain families, Luke did not discourage marriage and procreation. Luke founded his Jedi Academy on Yavin 4 in the Great Temple that had once been the secret base of the Rebel Alliance. He considered it an institution established not only for learning but also for discussion. Rather than dictate what the new Jedi should think himself, he encouraged his trainees to arrive at their own conclusions as a group. While most students regarded the academy as a place of contemplation where they could learn to use their powers, some saw it as a haven where they could strive to overcome the dark side within them. The Academy's first year was marked by unanticipated events, including the resurrection of the Sith Lord Exar Kun's spirit, which resulted in the death of Luke's first student, Gantoris, and the dark side seduction of his most powerful student, Kip Durin. Mara Jade, Corran Horn, and Kyle Katarn left the Praxium for different reasons, but each eventually returned to resume their training at some point. Although critics within the New Republic suggested that Luke Skywalker might have done better to begin with fewer students, all the surviving students were stronger and more united by their experiences, and better prepared for service to the government. Academy students subscribed to the basic tenets that characterized a balanced approach to their role in galactic affairs. The Force is to be used to save lives, not to take lives. The Force should never be used for personal gain. Every Jedi has a vote in making decisions for the group. The Jedi should work to support and maintain the New Republic, but not at the expense of Jedi ideals. If the Jedi are called upon to fight, they will defend the helpless without hatred, anger, or thoughts of revenge. Using an illusion technique Luke learned from the Falanasi, he kept the Jedi Academy relatively safe from casual inspection. Some Jedi students would eventually see their own Force-sensitive children follow in their footsteps. These offspring included the twins Jaina and Jacen Solo and their younger brother Anakin, and Ben Skywalker, the son of Luke and Mara Jade Skywalker. The Sith Lord Exar Kun's spirit was trapped for 4 millennia in the temples of Yavin 4, before it was briefly stirred by Luke Skywalker's arrival at the Rebel Alliance base. 11 years later, when Luke founded the Jedi Academy on Yavin 4, Exar Kun corrupted Luke's most powerful student, Kip Durin, and attempted to resurrect himself by draining power from Luke and the other Jedi trainees. Among the trainees were Streen, a former gas prospector, and Kirana T of Dathomir, who eventually became Jedi Masters and co-founded a new Jedi Praxium to train Dathomirian Force sensitives. 9 years after the conflict with Exar Kun, Streen made the following recording, detailing Exar Kun's resurrection from his perspective. I'm not much of a storyteller, but after Tion heard me talking with some youngsters who'd asked me about the business with Exar Kun, she wanted me to tell it again for the record, so here I am. Just so you know, I'm not going to try for a whole history of Exar Kun or what Kip Durin went through. There's other records for that, and Tion can direct you to them. I'm just going to say what I remember about the Dark Man's last day on Yavin 4. The Dark Man had already caused the death of my friend Gantoris, turned Kip Durin against Master Skywalker, and put Master Skywalker's body into a state that hovered between life and death, before we, the other Jedi apprentices and I, finally realized what we were up against. A spirit who put thoughts into our heads to corrupt us. Sad to say, we didn't sort this out until the spirit had gotten his hooks into me. I told my allies that he'd been whispering to me constantly for weeks. He entered my mind while I was sleeping and made me think I was having a dream about fighting him. But what he was really doing was making me try to destroy Master Skywalker's unconscious body, which I very nearly did. Fortunately, Leia Organa Solo and my fellow Jedi trainees were able to stop me. I snapped out of the nightmare and thought Cam Solusar was going to take my head off before Kirana T quickly convinced him I didn't know what I was doing. After I recovered, I told everyone what I knew must be done. We had to destroy the Dark Man before he killed us all. It was Jason and Jaina Solo who told us the Dark Man was Exar Kun. They'd come to Yavin 4 with their parents to check on Master Skywalker. The twins were only 3 years old at the time. Turned out they could communicate with their uncle, who spoke to them from the spirit plane and told them Exar Kun's name. Tion already knew more about Jedi lore than most, and she knew a thing or two about this Sith lore. After Exar Kun's Jedi Master failed to turn his student back to the light side, other Jedi banded together in a massive strike force and followed him back to his stronghold, right here on Yavin 4. The Jedi combined their powers, unified their focus of the Force to lay waste to most of the jungles. Exar Kun's body was obliterated, but he must have used some kind of Sith sorcery to preserve his spirit within the temples. I was entrusted with Master Skywalker's lightsaber and was guarding his body. He was laid out on a stone platform in the Grand Audience Chamber, when the Dark Man returned and appeared before me as a shadowy figure clad in dark padded armor. A pulsing tattoo of a black sun burned from his forehead. I told him I wouldn't do his bidding and activated the lightsaber. Exar Kun taunted me, and it was a struggle to resist the anger he wanted to bring out of me. In the years I'd spent as a prospector at Bespin, I'd come to believe that I wasn't very comfortable around people, but I felt empowered by the arrival of my fellow Jedi trainees. They'd been waiting for the right moment to enter the chamber and catch Exar Kun off guard. Present too were Jason and Jaina, who stayed close to Silgal's side. Exar Kun was not impressed by our numbers. He taunted us, even seemed confident he might defy us, but then another Jedi appeared. It was the spirit of Master Vodosiusk Boss, who said, "Together Jedi can overcome their weaknesses. Exar Kun, my student, you are finally defeated." Then another apparition appeared, that of Master Skywalker, whose physical body remained inert. His apparition said the way to extinguish a shadow is to increase the light. Kirana T had activated her lightsaber, and she and I crossed blades through the middle of Exar Kun's shadowy body. There was a great blaze of light, then darkness flooded out of Exar Kun. The Sith Lord screamed before he vanished forever. Then Vodosiusk Boss disappeared too. And Master Skywalker awakened. Soon he was fully recovered. It does not pain me to admit that I couldn't have defeated Exar Kun or rescued Master Skywalker on my own. Even Master Skywalker was vulnerable to that Sith fiend. Only proud or overly confident beings think they are completely able to take care of themselves without help. Pride and confidence can make a solid suit of armor, but such armor is weak compared to the power of the Force, especially if it isolates you from the Jedi. Remember the words of Vodosiusk Boss. Together, Jedi can overcome their weaknesses. For years, Luke Skywalker had come to terms with his father's dark past as the Sith Lord Darth Vader, choosing to forgive him for the atrocities he had committed. It was Luke's love for Anakin and his faith that there was still good within Darth Vader that had brought about his redemption and the destruction of the Sith. However, while Luke was aware that his father had helped the Emperor destroy the Jedi Knights, he didn't know the full story or specific details until decades later. During the events of the Legends Dark Nest trilogy, R2-D2 revealed footage of Operation Nightfall to Luke, showing Vader's attack on the Jedi Temple in its full brutality. R2 emitted a long, descending whistle, and the hologram of a large, fountain-filled chamber appeared on the floor in front of Han. The viewing angle was from high in one corner, where a security cam might be mounted, and the only movement in the room was the water falling from the fountains. C-3PO protested that R2 couldn't possibly have recorded this footage, since it was obviously from a security feed, and R2 replied that he had stolen the file just before he and Anakin had left for Mustafar. The droid told 3PO and Luke that the recording was of a room in the old Jedi Temple, and Luke recognized it as the Room of 1,000 Fountains, which he had read about in old records. The hologram continued to show the empty room, and Han began to think that the little droid had found one more clever way to keep secrets. Given the effect that secret was likely to have on Luke, Han almost hoped that the droid had. But R2-D2's acoustic signaler began to emit the tiny sound of recorded blaster fire. Stray dashes of blue began to streak through the hologram, blowing fountains apart, burning holes in the walls, vanishing into the heights of the vaulted ceiling. Dozens of children, dressed in simple Jedi robes and wearing a single braid on the sides of their heads, began to retreat into the room. The youngest, those under 6 or 7, simply tried to run or find a place to hide. The older ones were attempting to fight, using the Force to hurl benches and pieces of broken fountain at their attackers. Some were firing captured blaster rifles, while a few were trying to use their lightsabers to ricochet bolts at their unseen enemy. For the most part, they failed miserably but bravely, deflecting half a dozen or a dozen attacks before one sneaked through and knocked them off their feet. The teenagers came next, backing into the room with their lightsabers whirling, weaving a wall of flashing energy before a column of advancing infantry. Dressed in what appeared to be early stormtrooper armor, the soldiers assaulted ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing 4-year-olds with the same brutal efficiency with which they slaughtered the older Padawans. Han recognized the soldiers as clone troopers. An older Jedi with stooped shoulders and a gnarled face backed into view, anchoring the line of teenage defenders, his lightsaber sending bolt after bolt back at the attackers, lashing out to cut down one trooper after another. A pair of Padawans stepped in to support his flanks, and the entire line stopped falling back, the lightsabers of the young Jedi weaving an impenetrable wall of energy that, for a few short moments, allowed nothing past, not a blaster bolt, nor a clone trooper, nor even a stray glance. Suddenly, a blue lightsaber appeared at the edge of the hologram, beating down the defense of the first Padawan and slashing through his torso, then slipping past the guard of the other one and cutting him down as well. The caped figure wielding the blue blade began to carry the attack to the stoop-shouldered Jedi Master. The two stood battling toe-to-toe for only an instant before the caped figure slipped a strike and brought his own blade down on the defender's shoulder, cleaving him deep into the torso. The older Jedi's gnarled face paled with shock, and he collapsed in too much pain to even scream. The Padawans continued to battle on valiantly, but without the Master to anchor their line, they were no match for the sheer numbers assaulting them. Their defense collapsed, and the caped figure stepped aside, standing in seeming indifference as the clone troopers poured past to continue slaughtering the children. Finally, the last of the younglings had fallen, and the clones stopped firing. The caped figure studied the room for only a moment, then gave a barely perceptible nod and turned back toward the entrance. The face that stared into the cam was clouded with anger, the eyes sunken and dark, the mouth set in a grim slash, but there was no mistaking who it belonged to: Anakin Skywalker. Luke rose, telling R2 that was enough. Though his face maintained its composure, he proceeded to his personal quarters on the ship. Luke was incredibly disturbed by the footage, seeing his father mercilessly kill children. Though he had long accepted that these events must have happened, to see them firsthand was something entirely different. But Luke was older now, a Jedi Master, and had superior control over his emotions. He meditated alone, hovering in midair as he sought to center himself in the Force. Though his father's actions were heinous, Luke still loved Anakin and knew that his father had been corrupted and enslaved by the dark side of the Force. So, this story is crazy. Full disclosure, I did not read the full Dark Nest trilogy. Someone just told me in a comment that R2 showed Luke footage of Order 66, so I researched where that happened, and then I bought that one book. I think it's the second book of the Dark Nest trilogy. It has like Leia on the cover. And I skimmed through and I read those passages because I wanted to make this video, and maybe, I'll get around to reading the Dark Nest trilogy, but that's really far down in the EU timeline, and I only finished the Jedi Academy trilogy. I haven't even gotten to New Jedi Order yet. I feel like a very interesting aspect of the Star Wars story is Luke learning about the stuff that happened with Anakin in the prequels and in the past and stuff. I have a video on my channel about Luke learning about the Mustafar duel and his thoughts about Obi-Wan leaving Anakin to die. And that's like the biggest video I've ever done. Thank you to everyone who's watched that video. I really appreciate it. It's insane to see how many views it got. And I'm not trying to brag or anything. I'm just saying those are really interesting stories. And to know that Luke actually saw footage of Anakin killing younglings and children and Padawans in the temple is pretty crazy. It's different in canon. In canon, he is just told about Order 66 and that Darth Vader was one of like the enforcers that hunted down all the Jedi, which is pretty much what he knew before. But in Legends, Luke actually saw like full footage of Anakin killing children. And I think what's really interesting about that is, Luke forgave his father and believed that there was still good in him and that he could redeem him and everything. So it's like, if Luke learned all of this information, would he still forgive Anakin? Would he still feel the same way about his father? Luke, knowing everything that Anakin did, even though he probably accepted it, seeing the footage is a lot different. And that's why this story is very interesting, just to get a quick glimpse into Luke's thoughts on Order 66. Also, when he's a much older Jedi, he's a master, he's in better control of his emotions. I think if he saw the footage, like right after Return of the Jedi, he probably would have had a very different reaction to it. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and may the Force be with you.